I had been hiking the Pisgah National Forest for 12 years. Not casually, seriously. Extended solo trips, navigation by topo map, the kind of hiking that takes you off marked trails into sections that see almost no foot traffic. I knew this forest. On a Wednesday in October, I was 3 days into a 5-day solo trip, a route I had done before, mostly off-trail along a ridge system through an area that had been my favorite section of the forest for the better part of a decade. The weather was perfect, cool and clear, the leaves had turned, and the forest was doing what October forests do in the southern Appalachians. I was moving well, in the specific state of contentment that comes from being exactly where you want to be. At mid-afternoon, I was descending a ridge toward a creek crossing where I planned to camp for the night. The descent was steep enough to require attention, loose shale in places, root systems across the slope. I was watching my feet when I stopped, not because of anything I saw, because of the silence. The forest had gone quiet. 12 years in these mountains had given me a deep familiarity with what that meant. Something significant had moved. I stood still and looked up from my feet. On the slope below me, maybe 60 feet down where the ridge flattened toward the creek drainage, there was a figure, standing still, looking up at me. Not a hiker, the posture was wrong, no pack, no poles, no gear visible. Just a person on a steep ridge in a section of Pisgah that was accessible but rarely visited. Looking up at me, we looked at each other for what I estimate was about 15 seconds. Then the figure turned and moved into the trees. Not down toward the creek, but laterally, across the ridge into the denser forest to the east. Fast, moving through that terrain faster than I would have. I stood on that ridge for a long time after the figure disappeared. Then I made a decision. I did not go down to the creek. I changed my planned camp location, worked back up the ridge to a higher and more exposed position with better sight lines in every direction, and set up on a rocky outcrop where no one could approach without crossing open ground. I had a satellite communicator. I sent a message to my emergency contact with my location and a brief description of what I had seen. She replied immediately that she had it and asked me to check in at 8. I checked in at 8 and at midnight. I broke camp before dawn and exited the forest a day early. At the ranger station, I filed a report, not a distress call, but a record. A person matching this description in this location on this date. The ranger took it seriously. He said that drainage I had been descending toward had 2 other reports in the past 18 months with similar descriptions. A person in that area who was not on any permit or registration, moving through terrain most people cannot navigate at that speed. He said whoever it was knew that forest well. He said my decision to change camp and exit early was the right read. And he said the satellite communicator was why I had felt comfortable changing my plans, why my family knew where I was when I saw something that changed everything. Never go into a forest like that without one. I was 4 miles from the trailhead. For miles in Olympic backcountry is not a trivial distance. The terrain in that part of the park is dense and technical, and 4 miles can represent the better part of a day's travel. I was on day 2 of a 3-day solo permitted trip in the Hoh River corridor, a section of the park that sees moderate traffic in summer and very little in the shoulder season. I was in the shoulder season, September. The summer crowd's gone. The trail mostly mine. I was looking for my planned second night campsite, a designated site I had used on a previous trip, a flat area beside a tributary creek away from the main trail. I found the site, and the site was already occupied. Not by a permitted camper. There was no tent, no camp chair, no organized gear. The site had been settled. A structure built from forest materials, branches and bark and debris. Not an emergency shelter, but something more permanent. Something built and added to over time. Inside there was bedding. Not a sleeping bag, but layers of vegetation and repurposed materials. Food stores cached in a way that showed knowledge of wildlife management, elevated and away from the sleeping area. A fire ring with multiple layers of ash that had been used many times. Someone was living there, in the designated backcountry campsite I had a permit for, in a section of Olympic National Park that required permits and had regulated camping. I did not investigate further. I noted what I could see from the perimeter and moved back toward the main trail. I had my satellite communicator. I sent a message to the park's emergency contact number, which I had programmed before leaving, described my location and the campsite number and what I had found. I moved back down the trail about a mile and a half to a location with better terrain visibility and made a minimal camp for the night with the communicator in my hand. Park rangers hiked in the following morning. They found the structure as I had described it. The individual was not present, but evidence in the structure and surrounding area suggested occupation extending well beyond my 3-day trip window. The ranger's estimate based on the fire ring accumulation and structure construction was months. In a national park, without a permit, in a designated backcountry campsite. The ranger said what I had found was not unprecedented, that people chose backcountry parks for extended off-grid occupation specifically because the permit system created a record of who was supposed to be there, but enforcement in remote sections was limited. He said the gap between what the permit system recorded and what was actually happening in the backcountry was where situations like this existed. I had found the gap, reported it from a distance, and had not gone back. That sequence was correct. When you find evidence of habitation in a backcountry setting, you are looking at someone who knows that area better than you do. Distance and communication are your tools. Use them immediately. I have been hunting Pennsylvania State Forest for 23 years. I know what follows you in the woods. Deer arc around you and observe. Coyotes trail you occasionally, investigating the disturbance you represent. Bears sometimes parallel you at a distance. I know the behavior of everything that lives in these woods. What followed me in October of that year I cannot place in any behavioral category I have. I was hiking out after an unsuccessful morning in the stand. About 2 miles from my truck on a route I had walked dozens of times through mixed hardwood, across a gas pipeline right-of-way, then into younger growth before the parking area. I was in the hardwoods, maybe 3/4 of a mile from the pipeline clearing, when I became aware of parallel movement. In the trees to my left, not close, 70 or 80 feet, the kind of distance where you track something by sound and movement of undergrowth rather than direct sight. I stopped. The movement stopped. I walked. The movement resumed, matching my pace, about 60 feet to my left. Deer do this. Coyotes do this. But deer and coyotes drift. They do not maintain a consistent distance through changes in terrain and direction. This maintained the distance through a section where the terrain changed, through a slight direction change I made to navigate around a blowdown. Whatever was 60 feet to my left adjusted and stayed 60 feet. I stopped again completely and waited 2 minutes. I started walking. The movement started. 23 years in the woods. I am not someone who experiences fear easily out there. What I felt walking through those hardwoods with something maintaining 60 feet of parallel distance for a 1/4 mile was not panic. It was the specific cold recognition of being tracked by something that knew what it was doing. I reached the pipeline right-of-way, an open cleared strip about 150 feet wide. I stopped at the tree line before crossing into the open. The movement in the trees to my left stopped. I waited. Nothing moved. I crossed the right-of-way quickly to the far tree line. I stopped and looked back at where I had come from. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then movement at the tree line I had just left. Something had come to the edge of the trees at the edge of the cleared right-of-way and stopped. I could not see it clearly at that distance, but something was there at the edge, where I had been 30 seconds earlier. I walked the remaining distance to my truck at a pace I will call motivated. I called the Pennsylvania Game Commission from my truck. I described the behavior, the maintained distance through terrain changes, and the right-of-way moment. The officer was quiet for a moment, and then said that maintaining parallel distance through terrain changes was not typical of any wildlife behavior he could explain. It was deliberate tracking behavior, not predatory since predatory behavior closes distance. That it maintained distance was in some ways more concerning. A person who tracks through woods at that distance over that terrain knows what they are doing. He said crossing open ground had been the right move, that whatever was tracking me had stopped at the tree line, that it had not wanted to cross the open, and that I had used the landscape correctly. Use the landscape. When something is parallel to you and maintaining distance in the woods, find open ground. Cross it. Whatever does not want to be seen stays at the tree line, and you get to see whether anything is there. I want to tell you what it is like to be in my tent at 2 in the morning in the Idaho wilderness. Not to set a mood, but to give you the information you need to understand what happened. At 2 in the morning, 6 miles from the nearest trail and 12 miles from the nearest road, the darkness is complete. Not the darkness of a room with the light off, not the darkness of a street at midnight. The darkness of a place where no artificial light has ever been installed, and where the only light is whatever the sky offers. That night the sky offered nothing, cloud cover, no moon, no stars. Complete dark, and the silence that goes with that dark, the silence of a place as far from human activity as it is possible to be in the continental United States. I had been asleep for maybe 3 hours when I woke up. No specific trigger, just awake. I lay in the complete dark of my tent and listened to the complete silence. And someone spoke. Outside my tent, close, within 20 feet I estimated. Not loudly, a normal speaking voice. Speaking my name, my first name, clearly. Once, I lay completely still and processed what I had heard. My name, outside my tent, at 2 in the morning, 6 miles from the nearest trail. I had not told anyone my specific location. I had filed a general trip plan with the ranger station, the drainage and the approximate area, not this specific site. No one who knew me knew I was here. No one who knew me should have been in this wilderness area at 2 in the morning. I did not respond. I did not move. I lay in the complete dark, controlled my breathing, and listened. Silence. For 3 minutes, silence. I reached slowly for my satellite communicator. I sent 7 words to my emergency contact. Awake. Someone outside tent. Spoke my name. She was 3 time zones behind me. It was 11 at night for her, and she was awake. She responded in 40 seconds. Calling for help now. Stay in tent. Keep communicating. She called the Idaho State Police and gave them the coordinates from my last check-in message from the previous evening. I sent another message. Still in tent. Nothing more. Staying still. Outside, complete silence. For 40 minutes I lay in that tent and sent a message every 10 minutes. Just one word. Here. 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 So she knew. So someone knew I was still there. Idaho State Police dispatched a search team. The distance and the terrain and the darkness made a night response impossible. They reached me at dawn, 2 officers who had hiked in from the nearest access point before full light. They swept the area around my camp. They found boot prints. Multiple sets, more than one person, circling the tent perimeter. Prints that had approached and retreated. The prints of at least 2 people who had been around my tent in the night, who had spoken my name, and who had then left. The investigation worked to understand how they had known my name. The ranger station registration contained it, the general trip plan I had filed before going in. The lead investigator said something I think about every time I go into the backcountry now. He said the one-word messages, here, 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 sent every 10 minutes through the night, were what kept the search team moving toward me with urgency. He said the communicator was the reason I am here to tell this story. Not the wilderness skills or the experience or the gear. The communicator. The person on the other end who knew where I was. That was the thing. In complete darkness, 6 miles from the nearest trail, 12 miles from the nearest road, with 2 people circling your tent in the night, the thing that mattered most was a device the size of a deck of cards and a person 3 time zones away who was awake and paying attention. Get the communicator. Follow the trip plan. Check in. Every time. Because the darkness does not care how experienced you are. It only cares whether someone knows where you are.